Good morning, everybody. We're live here from the birdhouse, and today we're talking about the monarch butterfly. We did an in-person class about it on Saturday, and not everybody could make it, so we've had requests to do it online, and here we are. As always, we love to know who's online. You can say hello in the comments. If you have any questions, you can throw those in there too. And we always love to know what kind of things you're seeing out there in your backyards or while you're out in nature. So you can throw those in the comments. We've heard people seeing monarch butterflies, talking about monarch butterflies. People are giving more reports of orioles coming back to feeders, which isn't super surprising. They are getting ready to migrate. They'll be around, at least here in the upstate area. People see them sometimes even through mid-September or so. And then the hummingbirds will be around through September usually, but don't be surprised if you start seeing more hummingbirds as your feeders also. We've been getting reports about that also. So as they're getting ready to migrate, they are eating and they are getting all those calories in that they will need. So don't be surprised if you see more and more of them. We're definitely starting to get more reports of hummingbirds, which have been pretty sparse for people in general this past year. So that's some good news. But let's talk today about monarch butterflies and how you can attract them to your backyard and all that good stuff. So monarch butterflies, just like other insects, they start off their life as an egg, and that egg hatches and out comes the larva. In this case, it's called a caterpillar. That larva will pupate, and out of that pupa will hatch the adult butterfly. So they undergo what's called a complete metamorphosis. So just like a frog turning from a tadpole into an adult frog, where they change quite a bit, the butterflies are the same exact way. When you're gardening for butterflies in general, you do want to make sure that you are planting plants for each stage of their life. So for that egg stage, the caterpillar stage, and of course their adult stage. Monarch butterflies are pretty easy because if you do want to attract them, the best thing you can do is put out milkweed. They are dependent on milkweed as their host plant, but then they'll also, as adults, drink from different nectar producing plants, which we'll talk about. But in general, if you are interested in butterfly gardening and getting different species coming to your yard, each species will have different requirements. They all have different what are called host plants that the adults will lay their eggs on for those caterpillars to eat. So we've talked about this in the past as far as different host plants go. One example would be if you're trying to attract, say, black swallowtail butterflies. They will lay their eggs on things like Queen Anne's lace and parsley and dill and fennel. So that is their host plant. And then the adults, of course, will drink from those nectar producing plants. So as far as butterfly gardening goes, you can get pretty in depth with the different types of plants you need for different species. And we've talked about that in the past with our butterfly hummingbird gardening classes. So you can look those up if you're interested in that. Butterflies and moths, we have a whole bunch of different types here, and I'm sure the same where you are. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the differences in general between butterflies and moths. And their similarities. Both have larvae called caterpillars. And just like the book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, where that caterpillar is just eating and eating and eating, that's what these caterpillars do. They have mouths that are made for chewing. So this is a picture up at the top of a caterpillar from a giant silk moth. And here is its mouth right here. And they just eat and eat and eat all day. And as adults, though, as the adult caterpillar or as the adult butterfly or the adult moth, they have very different mouth parts that are called a proboscis, that are like a straw that they will use to dip into nectar producing plants and sip out that nectar. So the adults will have totally different feeding requirements than the caterpillars do. They are just so different physically. And butterflies and moths both have scales that cover their wings that give them color. They're in an insect order called Lepidoptera, which means scaled wing. And this is a zoomed in photo of a butterfly wing. And you can see there's all these tiny little scales on it. And that's what gives them their color. So if you've ever, for example, touched a butterfly wing or the wing of a moth, you might find that you get powder on your hands. That's from all these little scales. So you can usually tell if you're looking at a butterfly, you can usually tell if they are if they've newly hatched out of their chrysalis or if they've been around for a while. The older the butterflies are, the more tattered their wings get. Sometimes they're almost see-through and they're starting to lose their color. It's because they're losing all these scales on their wings. So as they age, their wings get more and more tattered and clear. So sometimes you can kind of have a feel for how long the butterfly has been around based on its wings. So what are the differences between butterflies and moths anyway? We get that question here and there. Sometimes people will say, well, moths are all very drab in color and butterflies are very brightly colored. That's not always the case. In fact, one of the most common butterflies you'll probably see in your yard is this one at the top left, the cabbage white butterfly, and they are not very colorful at all. But then there are moths that are super, super colorful, like this, like the giant silk moths, like this hickory moth down here. There's lots of very bright and colorful and showy moths, and not all moths are out during the evening either. We've talked a lot about the hummingbird clearwing moth, which you might see in your garden this time of the year. So how do you tell the difference between the two anyway? Butterflies all have antennae with some kind of a ball or projection on the end of it, and I'll show you a zoomed in picture of an example of that. Most butterflies and all the butterflies we have around here in the upstate New York area are diurnal or active during the day. And when they are at rest, they tend to hold their wings up over their body, like this picture of the monarch butterfly on the left-hand side here. So when they're at rest, they tend to keep their wings folded up over their body, and then they'll form a chrysalis. Now, moths will have antennae that are either perfectly straight or they look like feathers. Most of the moths we have around here are nocturnal, but we do have some that are active during the day. And when they're at rest, most of them spread their wings out. So their wings are spread out over their bodies. They'll also form what's called a cocoon, which is very fibrous. So here's some examples of those. This is a butterfly antenna at the top left. You can see there's a projection at the end of that antenna, so it gets larger at the end. And then you've got the moth antenna. This one in the middle here, it looks like feathers. And then there's another one here that is just perfectly straight. So their antennas can tell you what type of insect you have there. And then here is a swallowtail in the bottom left coming out of its chrysalis, and that's what's attached to the stem here. Whereas moths will form a cocoon that has a lot of fibers. And if you were to open up this cocoon, if you were to kind of unweave it and peek inside, there would be a hard-shelled pupa inside of there. But those are some of the differences between butterflies and moths. But anyway, today talking about the monarch butterfly, so we'll get into that. The butterfly that we're talking about is one of the largest butterflies that we have in our area, and it is very, very showy. It's bright orange. You can find it in a lot of open habitats, anything that has wildflowers and milkweed. Goldenrod this time of the year is just starting to turn yellow. That's a great place to look for the monarch butterflies. They're in a butterfly family called Nymphalidae, and those are the brush-footed butterflies. And if you ever look at a monarch butterfly close up when it's perched on a flower, it sometimes looks like they only have 4 legs instead of 6. And the reason for that is they have a reduced pair of 4 legs. So their first pair of legs is smaller, and they usually tuck it up in their body. So this is a picture of that here on the bottom. This monarch butterfly is perched on some flowers, looks like some asters, and it only looks like it has 4 legs total, or 2 pairs of legs. So that's another characteristic of the monarch butterfly. You can tell the difference between male and female with the monarch, and the males will have scent pouches in their hind wings. So this is the male on the left, and if you look at its hind wing, it has these little polka dots on it, and those are their scent pouches. The females do not have those. And the females tend to have larger, thicker veins in their wings also, which can be hard to tell if you're just seeing one at a time. So really the best way to tell the difference between male and female is to look for these scent pouches that are on the wing of the male. And you can see them when they have their wings spread, like this photo, and also when they're at rest and their wings are up over their body, you can still see those scent pouches. As far as their life cycle goes, they start off as an egg, and the female will lay the eggs usually on the underside of a milkweed leaf. And when she's laying her eggs, she'll curl her abdomen like this. And if you can see here at the very bottom, there's a zoomed in photo here of her abdomen, and there's this tiny little egg that's coming out of her body. So she will lay the egg on the milkweed plant. So if you ever see this behavior where the abdomen is curled like this on the plant, the female is laying the eggs. So pretty cool. The eggs are really small. They are kind of come to a point, so they're not perfectly round, and they have ridges on them if you're able to see it close enough. One female, a single monarch butterfly, will lay about 500 eggs in her lifetime. But out of those 500, only about 1 in 20 will make it to adulthood. The eggs do need to be laid on milkweed plants, and that egg will last for about 3 or 4 days before it hatches. And the whole life cycle of the monarch butterfly is all temperature dependent. So if it is warmer outside, it tends to go faster. If it's cool, it goes slower. If you're raising them indoors, it tends to be on the slower side too due to air conditioning. So it is temperature dependent. So it can vary a bit. But right before the egg hatches, you can usually see that the caterpillar is inside. This is a picture on the bottom left here. You can see there's a little brown black dot inside the egg. That's the head of the caterpillar. And when it's time to hatch, out pops that tiny, tiny, tiny little caterpillar. It's about the size, I would say, of size of a grain of rice or so. They're really, really small. And during that caterpillar stage, they just eat. They eat and eat and eat. In fact, the first thing that they usually eat is the shell of the egg that they just came out of because it is full of nutrients. So they'll eat that eggshell and then they will continue to eat the milkweed leaves. They go through 5 what are called larval instars. And what those are as the caterpillar is eating, they're growing and growing, but their skin can only stretch so much. So they will shed their skin 4 times, and each time they grow a little bit bigger. And each time they grow larger, it's called an instar, and they have 5 larval instars. So they do continuously grow, and every time they shed that skin, they tend to eat that shed as well, because again, it has a lot of nutrients in it. So this stage as a larva or caterpillar will last for about 10 or 14 days. So for about 2 weeks, you've got that caterpillar that is just eating and eating and eating. But then it comes time for them to pupate or to form their chrysalis. And when it becomes time for that, the caterpillar will enter what's called its J stage. And they will hang upside down and they look like a little J. And this is when you know they're about to form that chrysalis. And I've got a video here, a time-lapse video showing the caterpillar pupating and turning into its chrysalis. And this only takes about a few minutes. So it's a really amazing process and does not take very long at all. If you've ever been lucky enough to see it happen, it is pretty amazing how fast it happens. And it usually happens in the morning. So it's usually first thing in the morning is when this happens. So you can see the caterpillar was hanging upside down and it's starting to shed its skin one last and final time. And what's underneath almost looks like a bright green grub. And this is what will ultimately change and harden and become the chrysalis. So here is that bright green, almost grub-like structure, which is underneath the skin of the caterpillar. And it's still wriggling around. And then after a few moments of wriggling, it kind of starts to condense and will harden into the chrysalis. And usually when they go to pupate and form this chrysalis, usually they won't do it on the milkweed plant. They tend to wander a little bit before doing this, and they'll pupate on a tree or on a structure if you've got a gazebo, or if you've got any kind of structure nearby your milkweed patch. They might pupate on that. So they tend not to do this on the milkweed plants themselves unless you're raising them indoors and they don't have that many spots to form their chrysalis from. Then they might form it from the stems of the milkweed. But usually they wander a little bit and then they will pupate. So they will be inside this chrysalis for about another couple of weeks, about another 10 to 14 days. And you can tell when the butterfly is about ready to hatch out because the chrysalis will turn from that bright green into more of a black and orange color because you can see the wings of the butterfly through that chrysalis. And they tend to do this early in the morning. So they tend to hatch out early in the morning as well, just like when they tend to pupate is in the morning. And when they come out of that chrysalis, they look like this picture exactly. They're very, very crumpled up, and the body is quite large and full of all the blood. They'll start pumping their abdomen that has blood in it. It'll start pumping into their wings. They'll start to move their wings, and that blood from their body will go into the veins of the wings. The wings start to spread out and stretch out, and then you've got this beautiful monarch butterfly. And they'll usually literally hang from their empty chrysalis for usually about 2 or 3 hours so their wings can dry. And once their wings can dry, they will be out into the world. In general, the adults don't live very long. They only live for about 2 to 5 weeks. However, monarchs have a migratory population, which we will start to see soon, and they can live for 8 or 9 months. And those are the monarchs that will go all the way down to Mexico. They'll stay there over the winter, and they will continue that migration northward in the early spring. So we'll start to see right around now is when we start to see that migratory population. If you are raising caterpillars right now, those are most likely going to be the migratory population. You can raise monarchs indoors. It can be very simple as long as you can find them. Sometimes that's the hardest part. You can find the eggs. If you can find the caterpillars, you can absolutely raise them indoors. You just want to make sure you're constantly giving them fresh sources of milkweed. So they do need to constantly have milkweed to chomp on. Can be messy business because this is a fine example here, this picture of what raising monarchs looks like. They do a lot of eating and then it comes out the other end. So there is a lot of caterpillar poop, also known as frass, is the fancy word for caterpillar poop, to clean up. So you do just have to keep that enclosure clean and make sure that the milkweed is always fresh. But that's all you really need to do. And the monarchs will take care of the rest. And you can also provide places for them to form the chrysalis. You want to make sure the habitat that you're raising them in has some sort of a lid because they do wander when it's time to pupate. So if there's no lid on the top of it, who knows where they'll go. But make sure there's some kind of a lid. If there's a screen on the top, they'll usually form that chrysalis on that screen. You can put sticks and things in there as well for them to form their chrysalis. Monarchs do have some toxic properties because they're eating milkweed all the time. Milkweed is toxic to most vertebrates. And because those caterpillars are eating those leaves, they will absorb that toxicity. So the caterpillars are toxic and the adults are also toxic to most vertebrates. However, they do have some predators, like spiders are a good example. But the monarchs do have what's called aposematic coloration, which is a warning coloration. And they even have a mimic that has the same type of coloration, and that is called the viceroy butterfly. And we do have viceroy butterflies around here. We've shown some pictures on the broadcast before that you guys have sent in of viceroy butterflies. They look like small versions of monarchs, so they're smaller in size than the monarch butterfly. And they also have this stripe that goes through their hind wing that the monarch butterfly does not have. So that's how you can identify them. They have different host plants. They don't lay their eggs on milkweed, but they are around this area. So if you see what you think is a small version of a monarch butterfly, could very well be the viceroy, which is its mimic. The monarch does have predators, though, spiders being one of them. There are insects called assassin bugs. That's this thing on the top here. This is called a wheel bug. It's a type of assassin bug. They are predators of the caterpillars, especially, and the adults. There are also parasites that will lay their eggs inside the body of the caterpillars, which is pretty crazy. Those are the tachinid flies, and there's also parasitic wasps that will do that. But another predator of the monarch butterfly is even other monarch caterpillars. When those eggs are laid on the milkweed, or even when the caterpillars first hatched, they're very, very small. So if there are much, much larger monarch butterfly caterpillars on the milkweed chomping along, sometimes they'll chomp right through the egg or the small caterpillar. So that does happen. In their overwintering habitat, there are also some predators that are vertebrates, and these are 3 of them. The black-eared mouse is known to be able to eat the monarch butterflies and is not susceptible to the toxicity that they have. Same with the black-backed oriole and the black-headed grosbeak. So there are some vertebrate predators, but not many because they are toxic. In the spring, when temperatures start to warm and the daylight hours get longer, monarch butterflies will start migration up north from Mexico. And that's usually around March or April, and that's what is considered the first generation. So the first generation will start migrating up north, and all during that time they are laying eggs. Those eggs develop into the caterpillars and then the adults. Those adults will continue the migration northward until you get, usually up here, we've got the 3rd generation and we'll have the 4th generation. And it's that 4th generation that makes the trip back down to Mexico. So they are a few generations removed from the last population that made that same migration down south to Mexico. So it's pretty amazing that they know how to do it and when to do it, because they are so far removed from their ancestors, if you will, that made the same trip just the year prior. Here, where I am right now, is in Western New York, and our peak migration dates here are the 3rd through 15th of September. So that is when you'll find the most amount of monarchs migrating through this area. So depending on your location, you might have different peak dates, but this is when we have some from Canada migrating through here. And so we can have a nice big population of monarchs migrating through during those dates. They fly all the way down south to Mexico, as I've mentioned, for the winter. And depending on where they are coming from, that can be a journey of over 3,000 miles. They can fly, depending on the weather and the winds, they can fly anywhere between 50 and 100 miles a day. And if you had monarch butterflies in their most northern tip of their range, which is around the Winnipeg area, and you've got them going all the way down to Mexico, this whole trip can be 3,000 plus miles and last from August into November. So this can take months for them to make this journey, which is pretty amazing. You can tag monarch butterflies. So this is something that you can do. The tags are little stickers and they each have their own special code on them. And you can order them from a site called Monarch Watch. And that's a really, really great resource if you're interested in monarch butterflies. The website is monarchwatch.org. The tags will ship to your location when that fourth generation, that migratory population is around. And there's a spot on the wing that you can put these little tags where it's been found that it doesn't really mess with their flight in any way, doesn't impede their flight. It's called the discal cell of their wing. It almost looks like a little mitten. And that sticker can be placed right there on their wing. And what happens is if that butterfly is then recovered somewhere else along their migratory route, or even back in Mexico where they will ultimately end up, they can look at that little code that's on the sticker and they can figure out, based on the submission of the person who tagged it, where that butterfly came from and when, which is pretty cool. As far as their winter habitat goes, that is in the middle of Mexico. They like a very specific habitat full of oyamel fir trees, and the elevation you can find those at is pretty high, and it's usually about 2 miles above sea level, so they do like high elevation, and it forms just the perfect microclimate for these monarchs to live over the winter. And this is a picture showing just the mass of monarchs as they congregate. Millions and millions of monarchs will congregate on these trees. Sometimes there can be tens of thousands of monarchs per tree. Down in their winter habitat is where the tags are collected and recorded. There are people that are paid to do that down in their wintering habitat. If they happen to see a monarch with a little tag on their wing, they are paid to peel that little tag off and they can find out the data, like I said, where it came from and when. Monarch populations, we get questions about how the monarch populations are doing, and they tend to ebb and flow over the years. But this one really shows it in the best visual, I think. Their populations are in decline. And how they really judge to see what the population is by the size of the acreage of the trees that are being covered by monarchs in their overwintering habitat. So if there's a lot of trees that are completely covered with monarchs, that's a good year. If there's not, that's not so much of a good year. So last year going into this year, the season 2023 into 2024, the monarch population was pretty low, the second lowest recorded on record. That being said, they have been listed recently as an endangered species. And this is a very verbose statement here, just saying that they are in big declines over time. And their biggest threats are habitat loss and climate change. The change in the weather patterns can affect them as well. So the migratory population of the monarch butterfly is officially listed as endangered. So last year's overwintering population was the second lowest on record ever, which is not very good news. But what they found was that they started migrating back north earlier. So there was hope that because of that, their populations might be able to rebound, and they seem to be rebounding. That being said, we've heard mixed things from customers, at least here where we are in upstate New York, about the populations. A couple people said they've had really great success with monarchs this year and seen a lot. Most people are saying they're not seeing hardly any at all. So that can vary quite a bit. But the thing is, you can do some things to help the monarch butterflies. They are dependent on milkweed for survival. This is where the plants that they need to lay their eggs on to give food for those caterpillars. The females can tell that they're on a milkweed plant because they have what are called chemoreceptors on their legs and on their abdomen. So when they land on the appropriate plant, they can taste that they're on the right plant, which is pretty wild. So planting milkweed plants is the best thing that you can do to help the monarch butterfly. In general, though, when you're attracting butterflies, you want to make sure that you're planting for all stages of development those, the host plants are very important where those butterflies will lay their eggs, and also having some kind of habitat for them to pupate if and form their chrysalis if they are, especially if they're a different species that's not a monarch butterfly and they need a place to kind of wedge themselves into. You want to blend host plants and nectar plants, and you want to make sure that you do have plants that bloom throughout the season. So plants that bloom early in the spring through the fall. It's important to remember with butterfly gardening that the adults will come to the nectar producing plants, which is fabulous. And those are the ones that are really beautiful and showy. But your best chance of getting more butterflies and having a really thriving butterfly garden is to plant those host plants where those insects can lay their eggs and provide food for those caterpillars. You want to make sure to avoid any kind of pesticides. Those will kill the insects you don't want, but they'll kill all the insects around your garden, so you don't want that. And if you do want to get a whole bunch of different types of insects, brush piles are great. Some butterflies that we have in the area will hibernate as adults and wedge themselves in to brush piles, or they might form their chrysalis inside those brush piles. So that's another way you can attract more butterflies to your garden. You can supply water with a butterfly puddler, which we've talked about in the past. And then just making sure that you've got plants that bloom throughout the whole season. So milkweed is great, but it's not in bloom the whole season. So having things like asters or sedums or even some goldenrod in your garden this time of the year is really great for those monarch butterflies and the other butterfly species and bees that we have here. Colors can make a difference too, the color of the plants that you plant. Butterflies seem to prefer purple and yellow flowers, but then they'll also come to other colors like whites and blues and reds also. As far as the milkweed species we have here, there are 3. The one you're most likely, at least that I've had experience with, finding eggs and caterpillars on is the common milkweed. It has those really, really big leaves. It's a lot of food for those caterpillars. So this is what I tend to see the eggs on and the caterpillars on more so than any of the other types of milkweeds. This isn't one, this isn't a plant you're really going to find in a garden center usually because it is so common and it does spread quite a lot in gardens. So sometimes people don't like to plant it because it does spread so much. It's super easy to put in your garden though. If you do want the common milkweed, all you have to do is go out to most parks, any place that has a nice field, even roadsides, find yourself a common milkweed plant and look for the seed pods. And some of the seed pods are already starting to turn gray like this, I've noticed. Some of them are still green, but once they start to turn gray and start to split, you can gather those seeds, you can gather the seed pods themselves, and you can plant them in the garden. Or if you want to wait until spring to plant them, you want to store them in your refrigerator for a period of time because they do need to undergo the cold stratification in order to grow. So you can definitely plant common milkweed. I've got some growing in my garden, so I do provide it, but it is definitely spreading. Actually, I have all 3 of these. The swamp milkweed is another one that you can grow. The leaves aren't as large, but it is a host plant for the monarchs, and it does provide a lot of nectar for them. This is one that you can find in garden centers quite often. And just like the common milkweed, though, if you want to grow it yourself from seed, just go out there and look for the plant, and it will have the seed pods on it. This one there might be still a little bit of it in bloom and starting to fizzle a little bit, but you can probably still find some in bloom, and you might be able to even start to find the seed pods out there too. But you can easily find it in garden centers out there called swamp milkweed. And then there's also butterfly weed or orange milkweed, really beautiful bright orange flowers, and it has little seed pods that stick right up in the air. This is another one you can find at garden centers, another great host plant and nectar producing plant for the monarch butterfly. And then there's a lot of options for adult butterflies for the nectar for the adults. Butterfly bush, you can't go wrong with that. That's like a magnet for all butterflies. I always like Joe Pye weed. That's here on the left. That's that seems to grow really easily. It does spread a bit, but it's very easy to grow, provides a lot of nectar, blooms long into the season. Right now in the gardens, I mentioned goldenrod, asters, New York ironweed is in bloom right now. You can also plant things like coneflower and black-eyed Susans. So nectar-producing plants are important for the adults, especially when they're making that migration south. They need a lot of nutrients. And then finally, I also like to bring up an invasive plant that we have around here, and you probably have it in your area too, called black swallowwort. And black swallowwort is actually in the milkweed family, but it's an introduced species, and it's a threat to the monarch in a couple of ways. First, it grows and it spreads very, very quickly, and it grows tall. It's like a vine, and it'll tangle into itself and into other plants, and then it kind of flops over and it starts to choke out all the plants around it. So it can kill off some of the native plants or some of the other plants in your garden, and that's not good. But then it also is in the milkweed family, so the monarch will lay its eggs on the black swallowwort, but it's not a native species to this area, and it's not one that provides nutrients to the native monarch butterfly that we have here. So the egg will hatch, and that caterpillar might eat some of the leaves from the black swallowwort, but there's no nutrients in those leaves to provide the caterpillar. So the caterpillar can't survive on the black swallowwort. So not only can it create habitat loss because it will overtake the native plants that the monarch butterfly needs, but then it's also a plant that provides no nutrition to that caterpillar, which will sometimes be on this black swallowwort. So you can find this in parks, you can find it in backyards, sometimes you can find it in gardens. I get it popping up in my garden every year. I have to pull it. It does have seed pods on it right now. So in the spring, it has these little purple flowers on it, which are quite small. And right now, most of it is going to have all of these little seed pods on it. So if you do see it, the best thing you can do is to pull it out, and you want to put it in a trash bag. They say put it in a black trash bag and let it sit outside for a couple days and really bake in the sun, and then throw it away. You don't want to compost it because the seeds in those seed pods can live for several years. And if you compost it, it can still grow. So just an invasive to be on the lookout for. So I'm curious if any of you guys have seen monarch butterflies, if you've had luck with them, what kind of nectar producing plants they like in your yard. Absolutely let us know. It looks like there's some comments on here. Randy is on and saying hi to everybody. Good morning, Randy. Michael Warren Thomas is on, who usually has a lot of monarch butterflies, and it looks like he's got an update here. He says, I usually raise 100 to 150 monarchs from the milkweed in my yard, but this year I only found one egg, the earliest one I've ever found on Memorial Day. Nothing since then. Have other people been finding them? Not a lot. We've gotten kind of that same report from you that you just gave, that not a lot of caterpillars out there, not a lot of eggs. Usually we have people coming into the store with caterpillars, or they would call before and say, are you interested in raising them? Because Michael in the past has brought us a whole bunch of caterpillars, and we've been able to raise them in the store. But I've only seen one or two caterpillars on our butterfly walk that we gave here. We saw a couple caterpillars that were very, very small, and I've only seen one other besides that. I haven't seen any in my garden. I've seen some little holes in the milkweed plants, which make me think something was eating it. I don't know if it's a caterpillar or not, but I haven't found any caterpillars. Michael says, I know I didn't miss eggs because I haven't seen the pencil-sized hole on the leaf where they eat around the side of the egg. Exactly. The spiders seem to eat them at that stage. No pencil holes this year. Yeah, it could be that the predators are snatching them up. Deborah said her picture is blurry, but Ed says it's sharp and clear on his end. So might be a connection issue there on somebody's end. And Edison says, excellent presentation. Thank you. Comprehensive, colorful, and practical. Everything we need to know about these amazing little creatures. Thanks. Absolutely. And thank you guys for watching. We will be back on live on Saturday with another live stream. So if you are out and about or in your backyard, send in your pictures of what you are seeing, and we will share them on our broadcast on Saturday. So until then, have a great week, and we will talk to you soon.